Today on the All About Fitness podcast, I am speaking. For my YouTube audience. I'm holding up the book by Dr. Daniel Levitin, the book called Successful Aging. And listeners, you can't see this, but Dr. Levitin is actually pumping iron at his desk as we speak. How you doing today, Doctor? How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me on the show.
Certainly. Now, what is it? What is your background? Your background is a little bit different than mine. I'm an exercise physiologist, but what's your background?
Well, my formal training is was first in music, and then later in cognitive neuroscience, so brain science.
How does that evolve? How did that evolve? How did you go from music into neuroscience?
I'd always been interested in both, and so I started out college studying neuroscience and mathematics, and then decided I'd rather play music. So I tried that for 15 years. And I wasn't as good at it as I wanted to be. And so I went back to school.
Well, and what was your instrument? What was your go-to instrument or genre of music?
Guitar and a lot of different styles of music, funk, rock, blues, mostly, some
Interesting.
jazz.
And before we get into the book, but the one thing I read, I remember reading this somewhere, maybe I heard it somewhere, but aren't a lot of musicians actually really good at mathematics or at engineering because music is based in numbers, is based on like mathematical equations, sort of?
You know, that is a common notion, but it's not true. I
Okay.
think what happens is when we hear about somebody who's good at both, we remember it and we think, oh, isn't that interesting? And then we come up with a bunch of reasons why it might be. But statistically, no.
Okay, that's one of those things. And real quick, I noticed over your shoulder, is that the Beetle? Is that the Abbey Road picture over your shoulder in your office?
Yeah, it's a signed lithograph of the Abbey Road cover,
Oh wow.
signed
Okay.
by the four Beatles. And then below it is a picture of me interviewing the Dalai Lama for the book we're talking about.
Oh wow. Cool.
And then on
And
my other shoulder is Roseanne Cash and I after a gig we did in New York.
oh, that's cool. That's really cool. That's a nice little setup there. Now let's talk about that. Let's talk about successful aging. What caused you to write this book? What well, first of all, what is successful aging? And then kind of what was your motivation behind writing the book?
I think successful aging is being able to continue to do things that you take pleasure from and not have your chronological age interfere with that. Now, yeah, to some degree it does. If you're 100, you probably shouldn't be climbing Everest. But
If you got to go out, we got to go some way. Why not go doing something you enjoy?
well, right, right. But yeah, I mean, within reason, to be able to take pleasure from your life, to do the things you enjoy doing. A lot of people don't have that ability, either because of bad choices they made or bad genes or bad luck. But the reason I wrote the book is that we've learned a lot in neuroscience over the last 10 years that hadn't trickled down to the average reader about steps we can take starting at any age, at 15 or 20, really, that will put you in a better position to be able to take enjoyment from life by keeping your brain and mind healthy and growing. I think of
Well,
it as a
you
life
don't
hacker
even know.
book.
And that's when I was reading it. That's exactly what it sounded like. And you don't know this. I don't think you've listened to the podcast, but you actually just defined. You just described my mission for the podcast. My mission is to get people thinking about fitness as having the ability to do what you want to do when you want to do it, and that just coincides with successful aging. So, what are the three strands? You identify three strands, and you write of successful aging. And what are those strands? Why should people pay attention to those?
I think of the way that your life turns out sits on a three-legged stool. One of them is genetics. The genes that you're born with, in most cases, are not perfectly predictive. They're not perfectly predictive of how you'll come out, but they're an influence. You can have a predisposition. I mean, for example, I I have the kind of fast twitch muscle fibers that mean that as a kid I was a good sprinter, and I took prizes in the 50 and the 100. But
Wow.
I've tried doing. I mean, a little kid, elementary school, junior high, and not enough to compete in high school even, but it was something. But
Yeah, but still, yeah.
I've tried to jog 5, 10 miles. My body's not made that way. I can do it, but it's I'm born with a different genetic makeup, which favors one over the other.
And then what is the second strand? The second strand, you have genetics, and then what's the second strand of the stool or the second leg?
The second leg is your environment and culture that you were raised in. Certainly, if you're in an environment that, a culture, a family that promotes fitness, good diet, exercise, good sleep habits, you're going to fare better, as opposed to having like a crack addict parent, or, completely disorganized household. Not your fault, beyond your control. But the reality is, if you were raised like that, you have more work to do to overcome it. And the third leg of the stool is just random stuff that happens to you. Apart from environment and culture, did you meet somebody who was inspiring? Did you, sprain your ankle and it took you out for a season, just because there was a pothole, random stuff.
And that, I found that one of the things that I found very interesting, doctor, is you identify aging as kind of like, we look at, because normally we look at development and we look at childhood development, we look at teen, and I've heard that, the male brain, for example, doesn't stop developing until our mid-20s, but you kind of identify aging as a later stage of adult development. What is it about that caused you to kind of classify that?
Thanks for asking, Pete. Well, I think that the old societal narrative, which is not supported by the current science, is that we have brains that grow and get better and better through our teen years, 20s, 30s. And then at some point, 40, 50, 60, it's all downhill. Your brain just declines. It's worn out. You're doddering, your memory's bad. That might have been true 100 years ago when we didn't have the healthy practices that we do now, the ability to beat a number of debilitating diseases. Now, the brain continues to change and grow at every age. And older age is just another phase. It's just another part of your lifespan.
Well,
it has its own unique challenges and its own unique advantages.
Well, if you don't mind my asking, I really liked how you shared your personal experience with both your grandfather and your father. Can you explain? Can you kind of describe a little bit? Because I thought your father's experience was very intriguing and provides a good example of just how to engage. I think it provides a great example of successful aging.
Yeah, so these things, of course, happen in a familial context often. My grandfather was born in 1901. He lived through the Depression. He smoked most of his life because nobody knew that you shouldn't. In fact, doctors recommended it, and he was a doctor. When he was my age, I'm 63, he was not in good physical shape. His mind was not as sharp. He was slowing down a lot. And he got pushed out of his job as a radiologist, which is ironic in that radiology is all about experience. It's looking at funny looking blobs on a film and try to figure out whether they're cancer or a fracture or this or that. And the more slides you've looked at, the better you are at the job. Pete, if you need to go get an x-ray and you've got a choice between a 28-year-old radiologist and a 60-year-old, I'd take the 68-year-old.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I agree. Yeah.
So he was pushed out of his job and it spun him into a depression, and he died shortly after. He didn't feel that he had a purpose or meaning in life. My father, in a completely different profession, was pushed out of his job at around 62 or 63 in the 70s because 80s, because they wanted to make room for younger people. That's all. He was still good at his job. And he went into a depression. Of course, he didn't have the stimulation of having to report to work and deal with colleagues, some of whom he may have not liked, and having to perform. But 6 months into it, he sought and obtained a job as a professor at USC. And he's been teaching there ever since. He's 88 now, and he just signed a 2-year extension to his contract. And it's invigorated him. Yeah, he's one of the students' favorite teachers, and he's 89.
And I think, but I think, doctor, and you mentioned this, and I've read it other places. How important is the social engagement during the aging process? I know there are different components. I want to ask you about exercise in a couple minutes, but that social interaction, like the fact that your father is back in the classroom and engaging with people much younger than he is, how important are those social in-person interactions to help us achieve successful aging?
Well, it's crucial. The minimal stress and stimulation that comes from talking to somebody new is actually healthful. It requires you to stay on your toes. What you and I are doing right now, we've never met before. Two people having a conversation. We don't know each other. It's the most challenging thing there is for the brain to do. We're having to read each other's body language and pauses and find common ground. It's a whole lot of cognitive exercise that's more difficult than putting a rocket on the moon or doing brain surgery. And it's neuroprotective. You and I right now are building up new neural pathways as we accommodate one another, learn from one another. And, social interaction is key, especially people you don't know, people from other cultures, other perspectives, because that challenges you.
Interesting. So I just to let you in a little secret, I got into doing the podcast because I wanted the opportunity to really to interview smarter people and learn from them. I didn't realize that this was an aging benefit. But we're recording this via a video conference and via video link. And I know right now, and hopefully things change soon, but can we get the same benefits? Can you and I have the same benefits connecting video that we would if you're like my across the way neighbor? Does in-person virtual, do they allow the same benefits of that, having that dialogue and that discussion? Is it the in-person or is it just having that discussion?
There isn't a lot of data on this, Pete, but it does seem as though in-person is much healthier. Of course, during COVID, we can't do in-person at all, depending on your risk group and where you live, or even minimally in other cases. And so video is better than nothing, but being in person is very important. The three-dimensionality of it, the body language cues are different. Just the very fact that somebody could come right out and punch you if you say something bad, I always worry about that. I was the kid in school who was kind of bookish. And so I was always worried somebody was going to punch me or flush my head down a toilet or something. And the most interesting thing that came out of doing the research for the book was the notion of microcontacts. These are little meaningless 15-second conversations you have with somebody next to you in line at the grocery store or the post office. Or you're out walking in your neighborhood and you chat to a neighbor about how's the weather, how you doing today. Those little things have a huge psychological and neurochemical effect on us. They help us to feel connected to the world in a way that not having them in person doesn't do.
Well, it's interesting you say that because I've noticed, and this was pre-COVID, but I noticed that over the last few years, and for listeners, we're talking via video chat, but I'm going to hold up my phone here. One of the things I've noticed, doctor, is that nowadays, if you and I are in line together at a Starbucks, at a coffee store, we are much more likely to be engaged in a little screen in our hands than we are to make some innocuous comment about the weather. And so what you're saying, because I don't know about you, but I kind of miss that. I mean, I miss when I lived in Washington, D.C., I was just telling somebody about my former neighbor. I had a neighbor in the building next door who'd always be out smoking. And regardless of how I feel about smoking, whatever, but I loved the fact that he was there, and I'd go out to walk my dog, and sometimes I wouldn't come back in for a while because Poe, it was his name, and Poe and I would be talking about the football team. We'd be talking about whatever, just having some random conversation. So in your findings, you found that those just kind of interactions, they're very important to us as we age. Is that what your research showed?
Yeah, at any age, and especially in old age. And in terms of feeling high levels of life satisfaction and belongingness and being part of a community, all of things which correlate with, you know, with overall happiness, those microcontacts were underappreciated.
Hmm.
And, you know, even during the COVID, I'm in Los Angeles, we've got a little grocery store across the street, a little market, not a big chain or anything. And I'll go in at 8 in the morning when it's mostly empty, and I'll buy groceries, and I talk to the owner, who I know, and I talk to the staff there. And yeah, I'm wearing a mask, of course. They're wearing masks, but it's hard to describe, but it makes me feel a little bit lighter.
Hmm. Well, it makes you feel like a part of a community. Like
Yeah, and
even
I'm
in a
not just
metroplex like LA, LA is huge, but
yeah.
here you are, you have like your little interactions.
Yeah, and I'm not just stuck in my own head. You know, it would be easy for me to just stay in my computer all the time. I'm going out, I'm seeing other people, I'm learning about what they're doing. You know, one of the checkout girls is taking a year off from college, and then she's going to go to graduate school. Uh, Young women, not girls, sorry. And you know, there's another checkout guy who lives in the neighborhood, and you know, he works at the local store. The owner used to be in the video business. He used
Hmm.
to sell video equipment. Now, then his father died, left him the store, and he became a grocery man.
Interesting. Oh, interesting. And so let's switch gears now to talk a little bit about exercise, because one of the things you write about quite a bit in the book, and your background is as a neuroscientist. How important is exercise in the aging process? And is there any particular type of exercise that might be more important than others?
Well, so exercise is, of course, important for obvious reasons. It oxygenates the blood. It helps you keep muscle tone, improves your sense of balance. But if you look at Americans who are mostly a sedentary people, the biggest differences we find, probably not so much among your listeners, this is all about fitness, it's not all about couch potatoing, but the biggest difference we find is that if people will just get up off the couch and walk around the block twice a day, that has a huge impact on health and a number of different markers of health, more so than whether you add 5 extra minutes on the elliptical or an extra 20 minutes worth of repetitions in the gym. Those are good too, but the real problem is sedentarism. And another thing had been underappreciated, my colleague Scott Grafton, a very manly man, exercised, focused neurologist at UC Santa Barbara. He wrote a book on embodied cognition, a wonderful book. And the idea is that your brain learns by navigating and by interacting with the environment.
Hmm.
I love going to the gym. I like the machines, but he's talking about going hiking, especially on a rough trail. His book is called Physical Intelligence. And you know, you're walking on a rough trail, you've got to make thousands of micro decisions about what angle to put your foot at and how much weight to put on it. And, you know, over the course of an hour walk, there's a lot of adjustment. You've got to stay out of the way of hazards on the ground and, you know, in the air, and not get hit by twigs if you're in the forest. It's mentally more healthful for the brain than sheer exercise, just walking in the forest.
Well, that comes down to the concept of neuroplasticity, right? I mean, you're developing, what you're doing is you're really kind of creating new pathways. So the idea then is we want to get out of what we normally do and try new novel physical experiences. Is that what the research is showing, that might be a kind of a healthier or more holistic way to approach exercise?
Yeah, and it's interesting from an evolutionary standpoint too. So the part of your brain that keeps track of, you know, phone numbers and song lyrics and birthdays and such, you know, names of your friends, that's the part called the hippocampus. And it originally evolved over tens of thousands of years to help us with geonavigation. It didn't evolve to remember song lyrics and phone numbers, of course. So the way you exercise it is by navigating. Turn the GPS off if you're driving. Go to new places. That builds up the hippocampus, and then it has crossover effects to normal everyday memory.
Well, it's funny you say that, doctor. Number one, I do a lot of mountain biking, partly because of the stimulus. And number two, unless I'm somewhere new and I'm trying to get from point A to point B rather quickly, I really don't like using a nav. I prefer to look up I do the old fashioned thing, even on my phone or my iPad. I look up on the map and I actually write out the directions, point A to point B. And because to me, I like those kind of mental gymnastics. I know we've read things about Sudoku and doing that type of stuff, but how important is it to engage the brain and challenge the brain in new ways at any time, but especially as we start getting a little bit older?
So Sudoku, crossword puzzles, learning a language, all those are good. But take Sudoku and crossword puzzles as an example. If you've already been doing them a lot and you find them pleasurable, you should keep doing it. You do things that are fun. You should make time for fun in your life. If you're continuing to do them, though, just because you think they're going to help your brain, they don't really. If you've never done them before and there's something new, that will build new pathways. That's good. Learning a language. If you've learned languages before, languages are different than Sudoku and crosswords. Always a good idea to learn a language if you can. Typically, when you're learning, you would find people who speak that language. And so you'd be interacting, you'd be killing two goals with one activity.
Interesting. No, I like that. Now, to wrap it up here and respect your time, the last thing I have a note to ask about is the Harvard study. You refer to the study's been going on for years, and I thought some of the findings of that were pretty fascinating, especially when they track people out throughout the lifespan. So if you wouldn't mind, just give us a brief kind of overview of the Harvard study and what it kind of shows about achieving successful aging.
Yeah, this was one of the few longitudinal studies where you just track a whole bunch of people for 40 or 50 years. And, a number of things came out of it, the Harvard men's study. Again, it's only men that are of a certain age. John F. Kennedy was actually part of the cohort.
Oh, that's right, yeah.
And it showed that early life stressors can be very difficult to overcome. Not impossible, but and there are new findings coming out about it all the time. But the big picture part of the story is that the things we're talking about, being engaged with others, having meaningful work, following healthy practices, make a very big difference in overall life outcomes and longevity. And on the topic of longevity, I think a lot of people think, well, I want to live as long as possible. Well, sure, that's a good goal, but maybe a better goal is that for whatever length of time you have, to make sure that you can maximize the amount of time you're healthy and engaged with the world. If I could live an extra 20 years, but I spend those last 20 years in a coma or in a catatonic state, that doesn't appeal to me. We have less control over longevity. Some obvious things: don't smoke, don't try to keep your weight down, these kinds of reduce risks. But apart from the obvious things for longevity, the kinds of things you and I are talking about, being conscientious, being curious, making associations with others, learning new things, those can keep your brain healthier for a longer portion of the time that you're alive. So your lifespan might be, lifespan is the chronology. You were born, you die, you have a certain number of days. We can divide that into health span and disease span. Usually, in the course of a normal life, you're rolling along more or less healthy with some ups and downs. You get sick at the end, you die from what you got sick of. That last part where you're sick is the disease span. The health span is the rest of it. And the kinds of things you and I are talking about can push that health span out within the lifespan.
Well, that's exactly. I'm glad you mentioned that because I forgot that. I thought that was great the way you laid that out in the book. And for people, for listeners, if you want to understand, and I'm going to hold this up for YouTube, if you want to understand how to extend your health span and minimize the disease span of just what Dr. Levitin was talking about, I highly recommend his book, Successful Aging. Do you have any other information, Doc? I mean, I don't know how often you would post on social media or if you do a blog. That's the type of stuff I don't know as a neuroscientist. You might not have the time for, but if people wanted to kind of find out, because you have other books as well, but if people want to find out more about this and about how to achieve successful aging, what do you have other resources out there?
Oh, sure. I do engage with social media because I like learning from my readers. They send interesting emails and comments and such, and spur new ideas for new books and new research studies. I'm on Instagram
Oh, wow. Okay.
at Daniel Levitin Official. I'm on Twitter at Dan Levitin. There's daniellevitin.com, all run together, daniellevitin.com. And I just started a Patreon page.
Oh, cool.
On the subscription service where I'm writing stuff all the time. And I've found that, people might be willing to pay $3 a month to see it before it comes out, or to see what I'm working on that got cut from a book for whatever reason.
And I'm fine, but this book, I'm sure the excerpts of it could really provide a lot of helpful insights as we age. Well, Doc, I really appreciate your time today. I know we only had a short bit of it, but I wanted to introduce my listeners to your work because I think picking up a copy of Successful Aging could greatly help them enhance their overall quality of life, and that's my mission here. So thank you for your time.
Thank you very much for having me, Pete.